They laughed at the veteran digging in the Arizona dust. A homeless man with a German shepherd and a pile of rusted barrels, breaking his back in 108-degree heat. The council chairman called his work a fish pond. The town called him crazy. Jax Harlan had lost everything a man can lose and still walk. His wife, his home, his country's quiet thanks. All he owned fit in one bag beside a dog named Smoky who had bled on the same foreign soil he had. 50 days later, the worst drought in half a century brought that town to his gate on its knees. Before we continue, tell us where you are watching from today. The metal roof of the storage shed behind Eloise Mack's weather-beaten bungalow ticked in the late afternoon heat, with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each expansion of the corrugated tin sounding like a small bone settling against another small bone. The sound was constant, patient, and maddening, and Jax Harlan had been listening to it for 11 weeks without ever quite growing used to it. He sat on the edge of the narrow cot he had built from 2 salvaged wooden pallets and a rolled-up foam pad from a truck-stop dumpster in Tucson, his scarred hands resting open on his knees, his dark beard damp with sweat at the jaw. The heavy canvas of his surplus field jacket folded neatly at the foot of the cot because the shed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in July in Cochise County was simply too hot to wear any layer of cloth that was not strictly necessary for survival. The temperature inside the shed had reached 116 degrees by noon, and the thermometer he had nailed to the doorframe had quietly given up sometime after that. Its red column jammed against the top of the glass like a small, frustrated animal trying to climb out of its cage. Outside, the San Pedro Valley stretched toward the dry brown shoulders of the Mule Mountains in a long, bleached wash of ochre and sage, and the saguaros stood scattered across the slopes like weary men who had stopped marching years ago but had not yet been told they could sit down. Jax breathed slowly through his nose, counting the breath the way the Army medic at the VA in San Antonio had told him to count it before that same medic had been reassigned and Jax had been handed a pamphlet and a number that nobody ever answered. 1, 2, 3, 4. He could feel the sweat crawling down the flat of his back, beneath the plain gray cotton t-shirt that was already stiff at the shoulders with old salt from yesterday's work. He could smell the shed itself, the dry, almost sweet scent of superheated wood, the sharp mineral tang of rusted tools, and underneath it all the faint, clean animal scent of Smoky, who lay on her side on the concrete pad by the door because the concrete was the coolest surface in the building and because she had long ago learned to place her body between Jax and any open entrance. Smoky's amber eyes were open. They were always open, even when the rest of her appeared to sleep. Her thick double coat had thinned a little with the desert summer. Her undercoat shed in slow clouds Jax kept finding tangled in the sagebrush at the property line, but the black saddle across her back still gleamed when he wiped her down with a damp rag at sunset. And the scar along her right hip, the one she had brought home from their last rotation, the one that had ended her career and extended his, still showed pale and clean through the fur when she stretched. She lifted her head now just an inch, just enough to let him know she had registered the pickup rolling past on the county road at the end of the long dirt driveway. Her ears swiveled, tracked, evaluated, and settled again. The truck was not stopping, not a threat. She lowered her head back onto her paws and exhaled through her nose with a small, practiced sigh. Jax watched her for a long moment. It was easier to watch Smoky than to think about what had brought them both here, to the edge of a town where nobody yet knew their names, in a state he had never planned to see again after his last transit flight home 21 months ago. Smoky was in a sense the only uncomplicated thing left in his life. She wanted water. She wanted shade. She wanted to be near him. She wanted a task. These were needs a man could answer. These were needs he understood. He stood up slowly because standing quickly in that heat made the edges of his vision go soft, and he crossed the 4 strides to the small cooler where he kept the last of the ice he had bought from the gas station on Naco Road 2 days ago. The ice was almost gone now, reduced to a slushy crescent at the bottom of the red plastic, and the water around it was no longer cold but merely less hot than the air. He ladled half a tin cup into Smoky's steel bowl and set it down in front of her. She got up with that particular military economy of motion she had never lost. the motion of a dog who had been trained to conserve energy for the moments it would actually be needed, and she drank quietly with her eyes half closed. His own throat was dry. He drank the other half of the cup straight and felt the tepid water move down into his chest the way a tired body receives any small kindness. Then he stood in the doorway of the shed and looked out across the yard. The yard itself was nothing to speak of, half an acre of hard desert caliche, fenced in chicken wire on 3 sides, with a single cottonwood at the western corner that was somehow still alive and somehow still green. Eloise Mack's house sat 40 yards away, a pale yellow stucco bungalow with a sagging front porch and a swamp cooler that hummed from April to October. Her husband Walter had built the place in 1974. He had been dead 11 years. She kept his reading glasses on the kitchen windowsill next to a small brass compass because she said the two objects together reminded her of how he had looked at her the last time he had walked out to the car. Jax had been told this exactly once, in the same flat voice Eloise used for directions and grocery lists, and he had nodded exactly once and never asked her about it again because he had understood that she was not telling him a story. She was telling him a fact about the weight of the world. Eloise had been the one who had taken him in, or more accurately, she had been the one who had not turned him away. He had pulled into the lay-by on Highway 80 11 weeks ago, with $180 in a folded envelope, a quarter tank of diesel, a battered aluminum footlocker in the truck bed containing everything he still owned, and Smoky riding shotgun with her head low because the air in the cab had been pushing 110 for the last 2 hours, and neither of them had eaten since the night before. He had stopped to walk Smoky on the shoulder of the road near the mile marker. Eloise had been watering a small bed of oleander on the fence line of her property, a garden hose in her left hand and a wide-brimmed canvas hat shading her face, and she had straightened up and looked at him for a long time, with the kind of look women of a certain generation gave men they had decided not to be afraid of. "Your dog looks tired, son," she had said. "Yes, ma'am." He had not answered. He could not have lied to her, standing there in that particular afternoon light, and he had not yet been willing to say it out loud. She had nodded once, the way his grandmother used to nod when the preacher said something true, and she had told him there was an old hose bib around the side of her house that still worked and he was welcome to water the dog from it. He had thanked her. He had done exactly that, and nothing more. He had been raised not to take what had not been offered twice, and he had intended to drive on as soon as Smoky drank her fill. But Smoky had not wanted to get back in the truck. Smoky had sat down in the small strip of shade behind Eloise's gate and had looked at Jax with those endlessly steady, ancient amber eyes, and she had simply not moved. In 11 years together, Jax had seen Smoky refuse an order exactly 3 times, and every one of those times she had been right. He had stood there in the heat with his hand on the truck door, and he had understood, in the silent way he understood most of what mattered now, that his dog was telling him to stop. Eloise had watched the whole exchange from her porch. She had watched Smoky refuse. She had watched Jax go still. And she had said, without any particular emphasis, "There's a shed out back, Walter's old shop. Nobody's used it since he passed. You're welcome to clean it out and sleep in it as long as you're willing to mend what needs mending around this place. I can't pay you. I don't have the money, but I can let you have the roof and the water bib and the outlet in the shed. That's all I can do." Jax had looked at her for a long moment. He had looked at the sagging porch steps, the warped screen door, the chicken wire pulled loose at the west fence post, the cottonwood that needed its dead branches cut back before they came down in a summer storm. He had done a silent, involuntary walking inventory of every repair on her property the way he had once done walking inventories of village compounds, and he had known before he finished what his answer would be. "Yes, ma'am," he had said. "Thank you." That had been 11 weeks ago. And in those 11 weeks, the shed had become a place he returned to, rather than a place he was simply spending the night in. And that was a distinction that mattered more than he wanted to admit even to himself. The wife he did not speak of anymore had been the one who sold the house. She had done it on a Tuesday in February while he was still at the VA outpatient program in San Antonio, trying to learn how to sleep through a thunderstorm without reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. She had power of attorney, because he had signed it to her before his third deployment. The house had been in both their names, but the equity had been his signing bonus and his hazard pay and his death benefit payable to her if he did not come back. She had taken the equity. She had taken the truck his father had left him. She had taken the savings account he had built in $80 increments across a decade. The email from the lawyer had come through on a Wednesday afternoon. The divorce paperwork had been served on a Thursday. By Friday, Jax had been a man with exactly what he had carried in on his back, and by the following Monday he had learned that the VA did not consider him a homelessness priority because he had voluntarily vacated a residence he was legally entitled to. And the legal definition of voluntary in the state of Texas was, as the caseworker had explained, very complicated. He did not think about any of that directly. He never thought about any of that directly. He had learned the trick of letting those facts exist in his mind the way old injuries existed in his body, present, permanent, not requiring daily attention. Instead, the facts surfaced through objects. The folded envelope in which he kept the $180 had once held his discharge papers. The aluminum footlocker in the truck bed had once sat at the foot of their marital bed. The small brass tool roll he used to fix Eloise's fence post was a Christmas gift from the father-in-law who had testified against him at the settlement hearing by simply declining to return any of his phone calls. The past did not visit Jax as memory. The past visited him as weight, distributed across his body through the objects he still carried. The nights were the worst. The nights in the shed in July were something he had not been prepared for, because the daytime heat baked into the corrugated tin and radiated back down after the sun went, and by midnight the interior temperature had barely dropped below 94 degrees, and the air was thick and still and close, and his body which had spent 31 months across 4 deployments in Iraq and eastern Syria in heat exactly like this, in tin-roofed outposts exactly like this, in the same dry, dead animal smell of superheated sand, his body did not always know where it was when he closed his eyes. The first week in the shed, he had woken 3 nights in a row flat on the concrete floor with his hands over the back of his head and no memory of leaving the cot. He had woken with the taste of copper in his mouth, which he now knew was the taste of adrenaline pushed so hard through the body that it crossed the blood-brain barrier and reached the tongue. He had woken with Smoky, pressed full length against his left side, her heavy ribcage rising and falling slowly and deliberately, her weight on him doing exactly what she had been trained to do and what no trainer had ever explicitly taught her, which was to remind his body that it was still here, still alive, still on American soil, still within reach of something that loved it. He had not told Eloise, he had not told anyone. He managed it the way he managed everything. He counted his breath. He pressed his palm flat against the concrete floor and named the texture. He named the 5 objects nearest him. He named the dog. He named the town. He said his own name aloud exactly once, in a voice low enough that it did not carry, and he waited for the inside of his head to catch up to the outside of his body. In the 11th week, on a Tuesday morning at roughly 7:15, Jax Harlan had walked Smoky along the dirt track at the east edge of Eloise's property, following his usual perimeter, and he had stopped at a spot where the land dipped in a shallow gully toward the county road, and he had looked at that dip for a long time. The land dipped almost exactly the way land had dipped at an outpost he had once held for 6 weeks in the Anbar province. At that outpost, they had dug rainwater catchment because the supply convoys had been unreliable and because a sergeant named Delacruz from El Paso had taught him that in desert terrain, any water you could keep in a closed vessel below ground would stay cool and survive the summer. Delacruz had died in the spring of 2016, but the technique had not died with him, and Jax was standing on Eloise Mac's property in the summer of his 41st year, looking at a dip in the ground and understanding in the way a soldier understands terrain that he could build something here. He had gone into town that afternoon and begun to scavenge. The Bisbee scrapyard off Kings Highway had sold him 4 55-gallon food-grade drums for $18 each because the owner, a retired copper miner named Raul, had taken one look at his truck and his dog and his military surplus jacket and had quietly knocked 40% off the asking price without being asked. The hardware store on Main had let him buy 6 lengths of PVC pipe and a roll of geotextile fabric on a handshake promise of payment on the 15th. The old county dump on Juniper Flats had, over the course of 2 long mornings, given up 3 more drums, a collection of copper elbows, a galvanized hand pump, and a length of chain-link fencing that would serve as a pre-filter screen for the catchment mouth. By the end of the 3rd week of building, he had excavated a 40-cubic-foot pit by hand, with a long-handled shovel and a pickaxe, and he had lined it with the geotextile and a layer of broken river stone, and he had begun to set the drums in their final positions, each one interconnected by PVC, with ball valves that could be closed individually if any single vessel leaked. He worked from 4:30 in the morning until the light got too intense at 10, and again from 5 in the afternoon until full dark. Smoky lay in whatever patch of shade was nearest him, ears tracking, eyes half closed, her breathing slow and even. It was during the 2nd morning of the 4th week, while Jax was digging the final drainage run toward the lowest point of his system, that Gerald Fitch, the chairman of the Bisbee Town Council and the most successful residential real estate broker in Cochise County, walked past the property on his morning exercise loop with 3 friends from the Rotary breakfast, and stopped at the chicken wire fence and put one polished hand on the wire and tilted his silver head at the pit and said in a voice engineered to carry, "Excuse me, what exactly are you building there, partner? A fish pond?" Jax did not look up. The men with Fitch laughed. They were nice men. They were not cruel men. They were men who had lived in Bisbee their whole adult lives and who had decided some time ago that they already knew everything worth knowing about what happened in the small town where they had been born, and when they saw something that did not match what they already knew, they laughed because laughter was easier and cheaper than curiosity. Jax kept digging. He did not stop. He did not acknowledge. He did not raise his head. Smoky did. Smoky rose from the patch of shade beside the cottonwood, walked 8 steady paces toward the fence, and sat down precisely 4 feet inside the chicken wire with her full weight squared and her amber eyes locked onto Gerald Fitch's face. She did not growl, she did not bark, she simply looked at him, and she did not look away. And after approximately 11 seconds of that particular looking, Gerald Fitch took his hand off the fence and laughed a different, shorter laugh, and said, good dog," to no one in particular, and walked on with his friends. When they were 100 yards down the road, Jax leaned his shovel against the edge of the pit and climbed out slowly and walked to where Smoky was still sitting, and he put his scarred hand once on the flat of her skull between the ears. She did not look up at him. She was still watching the 4 men walk away. "That'll do, girl," he said. "Quiet. That'll do." From the porch of the bungalow, Eloise Mack watched the entire exchange with a glass of iced tea in her left hand and her reading glasses pushed up into her thin white hair. When Jax finally looked up at her, she raised the glass a single inch in his direction and nodded once, slowly, and turned and went back inside her house without saying a word. That was Bisbee. That was his life now. That was the place he had come to. Day 47 of the Catchment Project began the same way every day had begun for the last 11 weeks. Jax opened his eyes at 4:21 in the morning, which was 11 minutes before his internal clock would have woken him anyway, because Smoky had shifted her weight on the concrete by the door, and her tags had ticked once against the steel water bowl. He lay flat on his back on the cot for 7 full seconds, listening, verifying. The shed smelled of dust and warm metal. The air was already 78 degrees. Outside, the coyotes on the ridge beyond the cottonwood had stopped calling maybe 40 minutes ago, which meant sunrise was less than an hour out. He sat up. He laced his combat boots. He drank half a mason jar of room-temperature water from the jug on the floor. He put on the gray cotton t-shirt, which had dried overnight into the shape of his shoulders. He clipped the small folding knife into his pocket, not because he needed it, but because a man who had carried a blade that particular way for 12 straight years did not stop carrying it just because a war had officially ended for someone somewhere. Smoky was already standing at the door by the time he reached for the latch. Her ears were up and forward. Her tail was low and still. She was not alerting. She was simply, as always, ready. They walked the perimeter together, the way they walked it every morning, in the slow hour before the sun broke the eastern ridge and burned the blue out of the sky. North fence, east fence, south gate, west cottonwood. Jax did it because a soldier did not stop walking a perimeter just because the perimeter was no longer technically his responsibility. Smoky did it because Smoky had walked perimeters her whole life, and because her whole life was Jax. On the east fence, about 30 yards downhill from the mouth of the catchment pit, Smoky stopped. She did not stop the way she stopped for coyote scat or for the track of a javelina or for the faint thread of human urine that sometimes crossed the lower fence where the road crew relieved themselves during the county patching schedule. She stopped the way she stopped in Kandahar in 2014 when she had found the corner of a buried sheet of galvanized tin beneath a layer of wind-blown grit, and the sheet had been the top of something, and the something had been, as it had eventually turned out, a cache of buried ammunition someone had meant to forget. She stopped that way. Jax was 15 feet behind her. He saw the stop. He did not speak. He covered the ground slowly and settled on one knee beside her, and he laid his hand flat on the caliche where her nose had gone still. The earth there was ordinary, brown, hard, sun-cracked, scattered with the small gray pebbles that came down out of the hills in the monsoon runoff, but the crack pattern across a roughly 2-foot diameter was not the crack pattern of ordinary caliche. It was the pattern of ground that had settled at some point in the past, around something harder than itself. The crack rays ran in a faint ellipse, not a random web. His combat engineer's eye caught it in less than 2 seconds. "Show me," he said. Smoky set one front paw on the center of the ellipse and scraped backward, twice, precisely, the way she had been trained to mark without digging deeper than permitted. Jax nodded once. He stood. He walked back to the shed. He returned with his long-handled shovel, the rock pick, and the 3-foot length of rebar he kept as a probe. He sent the probe down first. 18 inches in, the rebar struck metal. Not rock. Not rebar from an old forgotten fence. Metal with the kind of deep, slightly hollow ring that only iron pipe made. He began to dig. By 7:30, the sun was up, and he had cleared a pit roughly 3 feet across and 2 feet deep, and what he was looking at the bottom of that pit was the curved upper quarter of an 8-inch diameter wrought iron pipe, heavily oxidized, coated with the pale green patina of copper deposits where water had long ago slipped through some seam and running, as far as he could determine from the curve, on a steady west to east grade. He sent the probe 2 yards further to the east and found the pipe again. He sent it 5 yards further and found it again. He straightened up slowly. He stood in the shallow pit and he looked west, up the long, gentle slope toward the brown shoulder of the Mule Mountains, and he began to do the math a man with 12 years of infrastructure experience and 100 forgotten classes in field engineering did in the back of his skull without asking his front brain for permission. 8-inch iron pipe, pre-1930 based on the manufacturing seam, running straight west to east on a consistent grade. The direction it came from was the direction of the old Copper Queen headworks, decommissioned in the 1950s and absorbed into the abandoned claim maps of the Phelps Dodge Historical Archive. The direction it went was the direction of the old processing floor at the bottom of the valley, which had been demolished and paved over by the time his mother was born. This was a water line, a mining water line, a century old. He did not yet know what he had found. He knew only what it was physically. He did not yet know whether it was dry, whether it was capped, whether it was connected to anything, or whether it was simply a buried memorial to a dead industry. He knew he needed to test it. He fetched a cordless drill from the shed, fitted it with a 3/8 masonry bit, and drilled a small test bore into the top of the pipe at the cleanest section he had uncovered. Water. Not damp metal. Not residual moisture. Water. Clear. Cool. Under gentle hydrostatic pressure. Welling up through the test hole in a slow, steady bead. Jax sat down in the dirt next to the pit. He sat there for a long time. Smoky sat down beside him, exactly the distance of one shoulder's width away, and leaned her weight against his hip. She knew something had happened. She did not know what. She knew her man was holding very still, and she knew he was breathing in the particular slow, counted way he breathed when the world had just turned, and she understood that her job in that moment was to be a warm, steady 3,000-year-old mammal, pressed against a man who needed to be reminded that he was also a warm, steady mammal, and that the earth beneath him was real. What Jax understood, in that slow, quiet minute beside the pit, was the following. A pressurized iron line running from the western slope down across the Mac property, still carrying flow, could only be fed by an aquifer on the far side of the mountain spur. That aquifer had been tapped in the mining era for industrial process water. The industry had died. The tap had never been properly capped. The line had continued to carry whatever the aquifer sent down it for the better part of a century, and because the downstream end had probably collapsed under the demolition of the old processing floor, the water was now pooling underground somewhere east of the Mac property, slowly dispersing through the caliche, doing absolutely no good to anybody. Unless someone capped it and redirected it into a closed storage system. Unless someone had, say, spent the last 47 days digging exactly such a storage system, roughly 30 yards upslope. Jax stood up slowly. He looked up the slope at his catchment. 4 interconnected drums, 40 cubic feet of excavated pit, geotextile lining, gravel filter bed, manual ball valves, a primary fill point at the top, a secondary overflow at the bottom, a distribution manifold on the east wall. He had built it for summer monsoon rain. He had built it thinking 1,500 gallons was a reasonable ambition for an entire season. If he ran a 3-inch reducer off the iron line, through a sediment filter and a copper bonding test, and up the slope to the top of his catchment, then let the natural hydrostatic pressure do the lifting the way gravity had been lifting that water for 100 years already. He would fill every drum in his system in a single afternoon. And then keep filling it, and keep filling it, at whatever rate the aquifer was delivering, until he installed a shut-off valve or until the mountain itself ran dry. He walked back to the shed. He poured Smoky a full bowl of water from the jug. He drank a full cup of water himself. For the first time that morning, standing up at the workbench, and he noted with a distant, clinical surprise that his hands were shaking just slightly at the fingertips. He had felt this only a handful of times in his life. Once in Fallujah when a routine patrol had turned up a cache no one had expected. Once in a hospital corridor in Landstuhl when a doctor had told him Smoky would probably walk again. Once on the porch of his own house in Killeen when his wife had told him on a Sunday afternoon in February of the year he had not yet learned to call the worst year of his life, that she had been seeing a man from her office for the last 14 months. The body's response was the same every time. The hands. The slow, cold thread down the spine. The steadiness everywhere else, because the steadiness everywhere else was the price of being the kind of man he had been asked to be. He drove into town at 10 o'clock. At the hardware store on Main, he bought a 3-inch reducing coupler, 2 brass ball valves, a sediment filter housing, a roll of Teflon tape, and 60 feet of high-pressure PEX line. He paid with $43 in crumpled bills and his last 20 in quarters. The owner, a heavy-set man named Dell, who always kept his reading glasses pushed up into his thinning gray hair, looked at the list and then looked at Jax and said nothing. Dell had served in Vietnam. Dell recognized certain quiet in certain men. Dell did not ask questions. At the county clerk's office in the small brown building across from the library, Jax requested the public record maps for all mining-era water infrastructure within the Bisbee Township boundary. The young woman at the desk typed his request slowly and printed him 3 sheets of faded blue line drawings from the 1911 Phelps Dodge Consolidated Survey. The drawings showed the western aquifer as a marked feature. The drawings showed the 8-inch iron line running east-southeast across Section 22 of the township grid. The drawings showed its terminus on land which, in 1911, had been owned by a man named Harlan Whitfield Mack, Walter Mack's grandfather. Eloise's property. Jax stood in the clerk's office for a long moment, with the 3 sheets in his hand. The water was not his, the pipe was not his. The mineral rights per Arizona surface estate law belonged to whoever held the surface estate at the point of discharge, provided that no prior claim had been filed by a subsequent owner. Eloise had inherited the entire surface estate, along with every unrecorded piece of infrastructure attached to it, when her husband had died 11 years ago. The water was hers. The water had always been hers. She had simply never known. He drove back to the property. He laid the 3 sheets on her kitchen table without a word. He pointed at the eastern corner of Section 22 and then tapped his finger. Once, on the notation marked Aquifer 3A, Artesian Flow. Eloise put on her reading glasses. She read the sheet slowly. She read the date printed in the corner. She read her grandfather-in-law's name on the survey. She sat back in her chair. "Well, I'll be damned," she said. "Walter never told me." He probably didn't know either. "Ma'am." "No," she said, after a long pause, studying the sheet. "No, I don't expect he did." She looked up at Jax. Her pale blue eyes, rheumey with age and the long, slow erosion of 11 Arizona summers of widowhood, were perfectly clear for a moment. "Son," she said, "what do you want to do with it?" Jax took off his cap. He held it in both scarred hands. He looked at the floor for a moment, then at her, then at Smoky, who was sitting on the linoleum by the refrigerator with her amber eyes fixed on the old woman, as if she had already understood something neither of them had yet spoken. "Fill the tanks, ma'am," he said. "That's all. Just fill the tanks." "All right," Eloise said. "Fill the tanks." By dusk, the tanks were full. 14,000 gallons of clean, cool, mineral-rich water in closed storage under the Mac property, connected by a 60-foot PEX line to a century-old iron pipe that continued to flow, undisturbed and uncomplaining, at a steady 200 gallons per hour. Jax sat on the cot in the shed that night with Smoky curled against his right leg, and he listened to the distant hiss of the new line delivering its slow, patient flow into the topmost drum, and he tipped his head back against the metal wall of the shed and closed his eyes. On the small battery-powered radio on the workbench, the 9 o'clock news from the Tucson AM station reported that the state of Arizona had just issued a Stage 4 drought emergency for the southeastern counties, effective at midnight. Municipal water allotments would be cut by 60% beginning in 72 hours. Residents were advised to fill emergency containers immediately and to limit outdoor water use to essential livestock only. Jax opened his eyes. He looked at the radio. Smoky lifted her head and looked at it too. He did not move for a long time. The emergency meeting of the Bisbee Town Council convened at 3:17 on a Thursday afternoon in the second-floor chamber of the old municipal building on Brewery Gulch, in a room that had been designed in 1905 to hold 60 people comfortably and that now, on that particular Thursday afternoon, contained 184. Every folding chair was occupied, every strip of floor along the back wall was lined with standing residents. The windows along the south side had been propped open with lengths of broomstick because the building's air conditioning unit had given out in the heat wave on Tuesday and had not yet been repaired, and the smell of hot pine floorboards and human sweat and old wood varnish rose off the room like steam off a bath. Jax stood in the corner nearest the door. He had come in at 2:45, 4 minutes after Eloise, and he had immediately done what he always did in any enclosed space containing more than 15 civilians, which was to identify every exit, estimate the response time to each, place his back to a structural wall, and calculate the angle of engagement from any conceivable point of ingress. The exits were the main door behind him, the service door at the far northeast corner, and the 3 south-facing windows. The response times were 6 seconds, 15 seconds and 8 seconds respectively. The angles of engagement were acceptable. He breathed slowly. He kept his hands loose at his sides. He counted. Smoky sat beside his left boot. She was not wearing her service vest. He had left it in the truck because he did not yet know how the town felt about her being in the building, and he did not want the question of the vest to become the first question that got asked of him. She sat with her front paws squared and her amber eyes moving across the room in the slow, deliberate, metronomic sweep that she had been performing continuously since they had walked in. She had already dismissed approximately 146 of the 184 people present as non-threats. She was still evaluating 11. At the front of the room, on the raised platform that held the council bench, Gerald Fitch, the chairman, was speaking into a small brown microphone with a professional calm that had taken him 31 years of elected service to develop. As your council has just outlined, Fitch was saying, the state's directive is binding. 60% reduction in municipal delivery, effective midnight Friday. The reservoir at Burrow Creek is below the intake weir. The Tucson pipeline is booked solid for the next 11 days, and the emergency truck haul from Phoenix will not arrive before day 8 at the earliest. I have personally spoken to the governor's regional liaison this morning, and I have been assured that the state is doing everything within its considerable power to. 8 days ain't enough. Gerald, a man's voice cut in from the center of the room. 8 days ain't enough, and you know it. A murmur of agreement moved through the chamber. It moved the way a single gust of hot wind moved through a dry field of dead grass. Jax felt it against the back of his neck. Fitch raised both hands, palms outward, in the professional calming gesture he had rehearsed for exactly this kind of moment. Al, I understand the frustration. We all understand the frustration. But I need this town to stay calm and organized, because organized communities survive emergencies and disorganized communities do not. I'm asking every one of you to go home, to fill every clean container you own with the water currently available to you, and to check on any neighbor over the age of 70. And then what? The same voice asked. Fitch did not answer immediately. He was a politician. He had been in the room long enough to know that the question did not yet have an answer, and that the answer would be the thing the town remembered about this meeting for the rest of his career. Eloise Mack stood up. She stood up slowly, using the back of the folding chair in front of her for balance, and when she had straightened to her full 5 feet and 1 inch, she did not speak immediately. She waited until the heads in the room had turned toward her. She waited until Fitch had registered her presence at the microphone stand halfway down the center aisle. She waited until the chamber had gone quiet enough for her to be heard without raising her voice. Gerald, she said, there's a man in this room who has something to say. Fitch's face did a small, careful thing. The corners of his mouth moved up a fraction of an inch and then moved back down. Mrs. Mack, the public comment period will open in. There's a man in this room, Eloise said again, exactly the same way, who has something to say. His name is Jax Harlan. He has been living on my property for 3 months. He is a combat veteran of the United States Army. He has found on my land a source of water, and he would like to tell this town about it. The room turned, as a single organism, toward the back corner where Jax stood. Fitch's face did another small, careful thing. This one was less controlled than the first. A flicker of something moved across his jawline and was gone. His eyes, Jax noticed, did not look at him the way a politician's eyes looked at a constituent. His eyes looked at him the way a man looked at a leak. Well, Fitch said, after a beat, of course. Mr. Harlan, please, come to the microphone. Jax walked down the center aisle with Smoky 3 inches off his left heel. He walked at a measured parade pace. He did not look at the faces on either side of him. He reached the microphone and he took off his cap and he laid it on the small wooden shelf beside the stand, and he set both of his scarred hands flat on either side of the microphone base. He spoke into the microphone without leaning toward it. My name is Jax Harlan. I served 12 years in the United States Army. 4 deployments, Iraq and Syria. Honorable discharge. For the last 11 weeks, I have been a resident on the property of Mrs. Eloise Mack, under an arrangement of labor for lodging. He paused exactly half a second. 47 days ago, I began excavating a rainwater catchment system on her land. Yesterday, my dog located an abandoned mining-era water line on the eastern edge of the property. I traced the line. I verified that it is still delivering flow from an active aquifer on the western slope of Section 22. I have connected that flow to my catchment. The catchment currently holds 14,000 gallons of clean water and is refilling at an estimated 200 gallons per hour. The room had gone entirely still. Even the flies against the south window had stopped moving. Mrs. Mack and I are prepared to open that water to the town of Bisbee on an emergency basis beginning tomorrow morning, free of charge. Distributed through manual container fill, 1 5-gallon jug per household per day. Under volunteer supervision, we have enough for every family in this town for the duration of the emergency. Jax picked up his cap. He put it back on. He stepped away from the microphone. He did not look at Fitch. He did not look at the room. He walked back up the center aisle to his wall position. And Smoky walked at his heel, and he put his back to the wall, and he resumed his quiet counted breath. And he waited. For the first 8 seconds after he finished speaking, no one in the room made a sound. Then a woman in the third row began to cry. She cried quietly. She was perhaps 70 years old, wearing a faded blue cotton shirt and small gold earrings shaped like Arizona sunflowers, and she did not cover her face. She simply sat in her folding chair and let the tears run down her face, and her husband, sitting beside her, put one liver-spotted hand on her knee and did not move it. Jax did not know her. He did not know either of them. He understood only that something in what he had just said had broken through a very thin wall inside that woman that had been holding back a very large amount of fear. Gerald Fitch cleared his throat into his microphone. "Well," Fitch said. "Well, that is a remarkable development, Mr. Harlan. Truly remarkable. Of course the Council is grateful for any and all citizen contributions in a time of crisis. However," the word however landed in the chamber like a small dropped stone. "However," Fitch continued, his voice regaining its professional calm, "we cannot simply distribute water to the public from a private, uninspected, unpermitted source in the middle of a declared state emergency. There are procedures, there are standards. There is the question of potability testing, of liability, of the State Department of Environmental Quality, of the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, of—" "It's water," someone in the front row said. "It's water coming out of the ground. Our grandparents drank water out of the ground their whole lives. With respect, Mr. Delacroix, your grandparents did not live in a state where the Department of Health can and will prosecute individuals who distribute untested water in a public health emergency. My daughter's got a 4-month-old, Gerald," another voice said. "My daughter's got a 4-month-old, and the formula needs clean water." "I understand, Mrs. Pena." The chamber shifted. Jax felt it shift. It shifted the way a patrol shifted when the terrain went from passive to active, when the people you were moving through stopped being bystanders and started being stakeholders, and Jax's body registered the shift 2 full seconds before his mind did. And he felt the old cold thread come down the back of his neck. And he breathed, and he counted, and he did not move. At the front of the room, Fitch pressed on. "The Council will move, effective immediately, to commission an emergency inspection of Mrs. Mack's property by a certified state water engineer, pending the results of that inspection, which I am told can be completed within approximately 7 to 10 business days." The chamber did not erupt. The chamber did something more dangerous. The chamber went quiet again. Not the attentive quiet of people listening. The cold quiet of people who had just understood something about the person they were listening to. 7 to 10 business days, Eloise Mack said from her chair in the center aisle. "Gerald, There is no water in this town in 7 to 10 business days. Mrs. Mac, I assure you. You assure me of what, exactly? The room had turned toward her. Jax, from the back wall, could not see her face. He could see only the back of her white head and the thin blue cotton of her shoulders, and the way those shoulders had squared themselves by perhaps 1/4 of an inch. Fitch's mouth moved for 2 seconds without producing sound. Then he said, Mrs. Mac, with all due respect, this is not the forum. Whose forum is it, then? Fitch gathered himself. The council will reconvene tomorrow at 9 in the morning. We will at that time review the proposal from Mr. Harlan and Mrs. Mac. This meeting is adjourned. He rapped the small wooden gavel on the bench exactly once. The sound of the gavel on that particular afternoon, in that particular chamber, into that particular silence, did something strange to Jax's hearing. For 1/2 of 1 second, the sound was not the gavel. The sound was the dry wooden crack of a door kicked inward in a village in Diyala province in the October of 2014, and the room around him was not the Bisbee council chamber, but a narrow mud-walled hallway in the low gray light of a pre-dawn operation. And the heat in his chest was not Arizona summer, but something older, something harder, something he had spent a very long time learning how to carry without letting it show on his face. He breathed. He pressed his left palm flat against the plaster of the wall behind him. He named the texture. He named the 5 objects nearest him. Folding chair, fire extinguisher, coat hook, American flag, Smoky. Smoky, without lifting her head, leaned her full right shoulder against his calf and stayed there. The room drained slowly through the door at the front, past the bench, past Fitch, who stood at the microphone gathering his papers and exchanging a brief, tight-mouthed word with the city attorney. Jax did not move until the room was 3/4 empty. Eloise found him at the wall. She did not ask if he was all right. She was old enough and wise enough to know that the answer to that question was always more complicated than the question deserved. She simply said, "Come on, son. Let's go home." They walked out together. Smoky walked between them. On the sidewalk outside the municipal building, the late afternoon heat came down on Jax's bare forearms like a slow palm pressed flat. The sun was still high enough in the western sky to throw long orange shadows down Brewery Gulch. A young woman in a yellow sundress stood on the curb, holding a small boy by the wrist. The boy, who could not have been older than 4, looked up at Jax and at Smoky, and then up at his mother, and he said, quite clearly, "Is that the waterman?" The young woman did not answer immediately. She was looking at Jax, too. Her eyes were very tired. "Yes, baby," she said. "That's the waterman." Jax touched the brim of his cap once and kept walking. In the truck, on the way back to the property, Eloise did not speak for the first 2 miles. Then she said, without turning her head, "He is going to try to stop it, Jax. You understand that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Yes, ma'am." "Yes, ma'am." Eloise nodded once, slowly. She looked out at the saguaros passing on her right, standing in the long orange light like old patient soldiers. "Well," she said, "so will we." The night after the council meeting was the hottest night of the summer. By 10 o'clock, the temperature inside the shed had not dropped below 101. By 11, the outside temperature had stabilized at 96. The air did not move. There was no breeze off the valley, no monsoon cell on the western horizon, no relief in any direction a weather service could measure. The coyotes on the ridge did not call. The cicadas in the cottonwood did not sing. The whole landscape had gone into the flat, breathing silence of a living thing trying to conserve itself. Jax lay on the cot with the shed door open 6 inches and a single 12-volt fan on the workbench pushing a thin thread of less hot air across his chest. He had stripped down to his field shorts. The mason jar of water beside the cot had gone warm an hour ago. He had drunk half of it anyway, because dehydration at this temperature, in his body weight, at his level of physical exertion over the last several days, would put him on the floor by morning if he allowed it. And a man on the floor could not protect a dog, and could not answer a door, and could not do any of the things he might still be asked to do before sunrise. Smoky lay on the concrete pad by the door. Her ears were up. She was not asleep. She had not slept since the meeting. At 12:41 in the morning, a vehicle came up the county road from the east. Jax registered the engine note exactly 2 seconds before his conscious mind had formed the thought vehicle approaching. F250, he catalogued. Diesel. Running lights only. Slow. Smoky was on her feet before he had sat up. The vehicle passed the driveway. It did not stop. It did not slow further. It continued west another quarter-mile, and its engine faded into the general silence of the valley. Jax sat up on the cot. He sat on the edge with his forearms braced on his knees and his head down for a long moment. Then he stood up and he pulled on his gray t-shirt and his cargo pants and his combat boots, and he walked out into the yard. The moon was 3/4 full. The light on the caliche was silver. The catchment pit at the head of his system was a dark geometric shape against the pale ground. He walked the 70 yards to it with Smoky at his heel, and he knelt beside the primary valve manifold, and he checked each ball valve by hand, one at a time. All 4 were set to their correct positions. The PEX line from the iron pipe was cool and firm under his palm. The topmost drum was full. The secondary drums were filling. He stood up. He looked west, up the slope, toward the Mule Mountains, and he stood there for a long time, listening to the valley. He was not entirely sure why he was standing there. He was not entirely sure what he expected to hear. He was standing there because something in his body, something older than his conscious mind, had woken him at 12:41 in the morning to the sound of a truck that did not stop, and something in that same part of his body was now refusing to let him go back inside the shed. He went back inside the shed. He lay down on the cot. He did not sleep. At 2:14, he was on his feet again. He had heard a sound. He could not yet name the sound. He walked out into the yard barefoot. The caliche was warm under his feet. He walked to the catchment manifold. He listened. Nothing. Nothing in the world except the slow, patient hiss of water moving through PEX at 200 gallons per hour. Doing its one job, continuing to do it. He stood there in the silver moonlight in his bare feet and his gray t-shirt, and the shake that had begun in his hands after the council meeting 7 hours earlier had traveled up his forearms and into his shoulders, and he understood, in the cold clinical part of his mind that was always still watching him, that he was approaching what the doctors at the San Antonio VA had called acute sympathetic activation without an identified stimulus, which was the clinical name for the thing that had no name. The thing that rose in his chest on certain nights for no reason his conscious mind could point to, the thing that came up through the floor of him the way groundwater came up through caliche after a hard monsoon. He sat down in the dirt. He sat down cross-legged beside the manifold, and he put his hands flat on the earth on either side of him, and he began to name. Caliche. Warm. Dry. Slightly coarse. Moonlight. Silver. Cool. Cottonwood. 80 feet northwest. Still. Shed. 40 yards north. Dark. Bungalow. 60 yards north-northwest. One window lit. Kitchen window. Eloise sometimes drinks tea at 2 in the morning because her hip aches and she doesn't want to take the pills her doctor prescribed. Smoky, beside him. Warm flank. Slow breathing. 42 breaths per minute. Correct. He named these things slowly and deliberately, The way Sergeant First Class Miranda at the 1st VA had taught him to name things in the months after his last rotation. When he had been a man who could no longer reliably tell a grocery store from a market in Sadr City, he named them because naming them was the way he remained in the present tense. He named them because the present tense was the only place Smoky lived, and Smoky was the only witness he had left in the world who he trusted without qualification, and if he could stay in Smoky's tense, he could stay in his own body. Smoky turned her head and pressed her nose, wet and cool, against the inside of his right wrist, exactly where the pulse lived. She held her nose there for a long moment. She was reading him. She was reading his pulse the way a corpsman read a pulse, the way she had read his pulse on a gravel road outside Tal Afar in the summer of 2015 after the IED had gone off under the lead Humvee, and he had been pulled out of the wreckage with a concussion that had made it temporarily impossible for him to answer the question, "What is your name, soldier?" She had pressed her nose to his wrist then, too, and she had not moved it until the corpsman had finally gotten his pulse down into the acceptable range, and the corpsman had later told Jax in the recovery tent that he was not entirely sure the dog had not been the thing that had brought his pulse down. He breathed. He counted. His pulse came down. After some indeterminate length of time, his watch said 17 minutes when he finally checked it. Jax stood up slowly from the caliche, and he walked back to the shed. And he sat on the cot, and he opened the small aluminum footlocker at the foot of the cot for the first time in 3 weeks. Inside the footlocker were the things a man carried because there was nowhere left to put them, his DD Form 214. A small black velvet box containing a bronze star and 2 purple hearts and a combat infantryman badge he had not looked at in 2.5 years. A letter from Specialist Dela Cruz's mother, dated September 2016, thanking him for being the last person to speak to her son. A photograph of Smoky at 11 months old, still gangly, sitting in the cargo hold of a C-17 with her head tilted sideways at the photographer, taken by a crew chief named Reyes, who had died in a motorcycle accident in Barstow in 2019. A folded American flag, triangular, in a plastic presentation case that had been handed to him in a hospital chapel in Landstuhl by a chaplain whose name he no longer remembered. And, at the very bottom, in a manila envelope, the documents from the divorce. He had not opened the envelope. He had never opened the envelope. He had carried it with him for 17 months, because throwing it away had felt, at every point along the way, like a decision he did not yet have the strength to make, and keeping it had simply been the easier of the 2 options. He looked at the envelope for a long moment, in the moonlight coming through the shed door. Then he closed the footlocker. He did not open the envelope. He was not ready. He might never be ready. But for the first time in 17 months, he considered the possibility that he might one day be ready, and the consideration itself was a thing he had not been capable of 72 hours ago, and he registered this fact the way a medic registered a faint returning pulse, and he filed it away without allowing himself to think too hard about what it meant. He lay down on the cot. He thought, for the first and only time that night, about leaving. He thought about it with full clinical honesty, the way a soldier thought about any option on any mission, without judgment, without romance, without flinching. He could be in his truck in 11 minutes. He could have the footlocker loaded, Smoky in the passenger seat, his gray t-shirts and his single clean pair of pants in the canvas bag, and be on Highway 80 eastbound before the moon dropped behind the mules. By dawn he could be in Lordsburg. By noon he could be in Las Cruces. By nightfall he could be in West Texas in a different county with a different sheriff, and a different set of faces that had never heard of him, had never mocked him, would not now depend on him. He could leave the 14,000 gallons of water in the drums. He could leave the pipe. He could leave Eloise Mack on her porch with her reading glasses and her brass compass and her dead husband's kitchen windowsill, and she would find another man, or she would not, and the town of Bisbee would survive or it would not. And either way, the failure or the success would not be his to carry because he would not be here to carry it. He thought about all of this in the cold, flat place where a soldier thinks, and he discovered, without any particular surprise, that the option was genuinely available to him. No one would stop him. No one could stop him. The road east was open. The truck had 3/4 of a tank. The choice was, from a purely mechanical standpoint, entirely his. He rolled his head on the pillow and looked at Smoky. Smoky was already looking at him. Her amber eyes were endlessly steady, profound and ancient in their understanding. She was not asking a question. She had never once in 11 years asked him a question. She was simply present, simply observing, simply being the warm, intelligent mammal who had decided, for reasons neither of them would ever entirely understand, that her life was to be lived alongside his. She blinked, slowly, once. Then she laid her chin back down on her paws. Jax closed his eyes. He did not leave. He did not leave because he had understood, somewhere in the silver minute between Smoky's blink and the slow descent of her heavy head, that leaving was not actually one of the options available to him. Leaving was a story he had been telling himself for 17 months about a man who no longer existed. The man who had been able to leave was the man who had not yet spent 11 weeks on the Mac property. The man who had not yet drunk coffee at 6 in the morning with a 79-year-old widow who called him son without irony. The man who had not yet stood at a microphone in a council chamber and told a town full of strangers that he had water for them. That man was gone. This man, the man lying on the cot in the 96-degree shed, could not leave any more than the aquifer under the mules could stop flowing downhill. He slept for 3 hours and 41 minutes. When he woke, the first gray of dawn was already bleeding up the eastern sky. The first thing he did was walk to the catchment. The second thing he did was register, with the slow, cold clarity of a man who had already suspected it would be this way, that the primary valve on the manifold had been removed from its housing and replaced with a padlocked steel blanking plate, and that a notice on Cochise County letterhead had been wire-tied to the plate, and that the notice read property under temporary inspection hold, do not operate order of the town council. Smoky, beside him, made a sound he had not heard from her in 4 years. It was not a bark, it was not a growl, it was a low, deep, single-syllable vibration in her chest, pitched so low that it was almost below the threshold of ordinary hearing, and it meant, in the vocabulary of one particular German shepherd to one particular man, "I have registered a hostile action and am awaiting instructions." Jax looked up at the pale east sky. "Stand down, girl," he said. "Quiet. Stand by. I have to think." He sat down in the dirt beside the locked manifold. He sat down slowly, knees first, then hips, and he laced his fingers together behind his head, and he rested the back of his skull against the stacked river stone of the pit wall, and he closed his eyes. The first light of morning came up over the ridge behind him and laid a thin, warm line across his face. The temperature at 5:47 in the morning was already 83. The cicadas in the cottonwood had begun their slow, dry song. Somewhere down the valley, a rooster on the Delacroix property 2 miles south crowed 3 times in rapid succession and then stopped. Jax did not move for 11 minutes. He was not thinking about the valve. He was not yet thinking about the valve. He was allowing his body to move past the first wave of response, which was always the hottest wave, and therefore always the most dangerous. The wave a soldier learned early to let crest and break over him before he made any decision that could not be taken back. The wave passed. He felt it pass. Underneath the wave was the colder, older thing, which was the calm. The calm was the place from which he had always done his best work. It was the place he had been in at the end of 4 deployments, at the end of a marriage that had outlasted 4 deployments by exactly 96 hours, at the end of a career that had closed itself around him the way a wound closed around shrapnel it had decided to keep. The calm was not peace. The calm was simply the absence of the wave, and in that absence certain things could be seen clearly that could not be seen in any other weather. What he could see clearly, sitting in the dirt beside the manifold at 5:58 in the morning, was the following. The valve had been removed by a professional. The wire seal on the blanking plate had been placed in the correct orientation. The padlock was a medico-commercial grade, not a hardware store unit. The county letterhead was authentic. but the signature line bore the stamp of the town council secretary rather than the county engineer, which meant the inspection order had been issued from inside the municipal building rather than from the county offices in Tombstone, which meant it had probably been issued in the 7 hours between the end of the council meeting and the current moment, which meant Gerald Fitch had moved, and moved fast, and moved specifically. Fitch had called in a favor at a state level. Someone at the Department of Environmental Quality Field Office in Sierra Vista had stamped an order without a formal review process. A contractor, almost certainly the F-250 Jax had heard on the road at 1241, had come out and capped the manifold under cover of darkness. The inspection hold would be, per the state administrative code, valid for a minimum of 7 business days and potentially extended up to 21 while the paperwork worked its way through the system. Bisbee had, at current consumption rates, roughly 6.5 days of water. Jax opened his eyes. He looked at the iron pipe. He looked at the sealed manifold. He looked west, up the slope, toward the mountain where the aquifer lived. The water was still flowing. He could feel the faint continuous vibration of the moving column through the ground under his hip. The aquifer did not care about municipal paperwork. The aquifer would continue to deliver 200 gallons per hour of clean mineral-rich water into a sealed drum system that had nowhere now to send it. Eventually, the topmost drum would reach its pressure cutoff, and the flow would back up into the iron pipe, and the iron pipe would, within some number of hours he did not yet want to calculate, either rupture at a weak seam or begin to vent upward through the caliche in an uncontrolled artesian discharge that would in either case lose the water to the desert. He needed to open the system. He could not open the main manifold. He needed another route. He stood up slowly, and he walked the full length of the PEX line from the iron pipe up to the catchment. And then he walked the full length of the catchment from the primary manifold across the distribution array to the secondary overflow. And he did this because he was looking for something he had installed on the 34th day of construction and had not touched since, something he had installed on a whim, on the habit of a man who had spent 12 years building systems that could fail at any single point and who had therefore learned always to build a redundancy into every single point he could afford, and he had installed it so quickly and so casually that he had not even drawn it into his schematic. A bypass valve. 1-inch brass ball valve, spliced into the secondary feed between the 3rd and 4th drum, hidden under a small square of galvanized sheet metal he had cut from a piece of scrap because he had not had the money to buy a proper valve box. Fitch's man would not have found it. Fitch's man would have checked the primary manifold, the distribution array, and probably the overflow, because those were the 3 fittings visible on any normal schematic. The bypass was not on any schematic. The bypass existed in exactly one place, which was Jax's own working memory, and he had not thought about it in 6 weeks. He walked to the space between the 3rd and 4th drum. He looked down. The galvanized sheet metal square was there, roughly 12 inches by 12 inches, slightly sunken into the caliche, dusty, partially covered by a drift of dead mesquite leaves blown in by the hot wind 2 nights ago. He almost knelt down to uncover it. He did not kneel down, because Smoky, who had been standing behind him in the gap between the drums, stepped forward precisely once, and sat down in front of the sheet metal square, and set one front paw on the exact center of the square, and scraped the paw backward across the metal exactly twice, and then looked up at Jax. She was telling him. She was telling him she already knew. Jax crouched down beside her. He put his scarred hand flat on her shoulder blade. She was trembling, very faintly, the way a working dog trembled when she had held a piece of information for a long time without being asked for it. "How long, girl?" he said. "Quiet. How long have you known?" She did not answer in any way a human language could record. She shifted her weight once, leaned the flat of her skull against his jaw for 2 full seconds, and then stepped off the sheet metal square and sat down again at the proper working distance. What Jax understood, in that moment, was something that would not have been understandable to anyone who had not spent 11 years with one particular working dog. Smoky had logged the bypass valve on the day he had installed it. She had registered the particular smell of the brass, the thread tape, the specific oil he had used. She had filed that smell away, the way she filed away every piece of infrastructure smell on the property, the way a dispatcher filed away every radio frequency on a grid. And last night, when the F-250 had come up the county road at 12:41 and 3 men had moved quietly across the south edge of the property with tools and a Medico padlock, Smoky had tracked every single one of their movements from the pad at the shed door, and she had noted, with the kind of silent pattern analysis that no human intelligence service in history had ever matched, which pieces of infrastructure they had approached and which pieces they had not. They had not approached the bypass. They had not approached it because it was not visible on the schematic they had been given, and the schematic had almost certainly been the utility filing Eloise had signed for the county in 1994 when Walter had installed a standard domestic well on the property. The bypass was not on that filing because the bypass did not exist until Jax had built it 6 weeks ago. Fitch's men had worked from the paper, Smoky had worked from the ground, and this morning, in the thin pink light before 6 in the morning, she was telling him, with the small precise economy of her front paw on the sheet metal, that there was a door the enemy had not found. Jax bent down and he lifted the sheet metal square. Underneath, the small brass ball valve sat exactly where he had left it. On the 1-inch feed line between the third and fourth drum, the handle set to the closed position. He rotated the handle 90 degrees. Water moved through the valve. He heard it. He felt it through the ground under his boots. The water was hydrostatic fed from the iron pipe through the sealed primary manifold, backfilled to pressure across the drum system, and now diverted out through the bypass into the distribution array on the east side of the pit. He walked to the distribution array, and he opened the 2 east side service valves he had installed for manual jug fill, the ones that had never yet been used because the tanks had only been full for 3 days and the town had never yet come. Water flowed. Clean, cool, mineral-rich water at roughly 12 gallons per minute into the 2 small concrete basins he had poured at ground level for exactly this purpose. He had built the basins because he had known from the first day of excavation that if water ever came out of his system it would come out for people carrying plastic jugs, and he had built the basins at a convenient height for an average adult to set a 5-gallon container under the spout without stooping. The basins filled. The overflow channel he had cut in the west lip of each basin began to carry the excess back down to a small gravel soakaway he had dug as a final step. The system worked. Of course the system worked. He had built the system with his own hands across 47 days in 108-degree heat, and every single element of it was redundant, and every single element of it was doing, at 6:04 in the morning on that Friday in July, exactly the thing it had been designed to do. He stood up. He looked at Smoky. "Good girl," he said. It was all he said. He said it very quietly. Good girl. She did not acknowledge the praise in any visible way. She was not a dog who needed acknowledgement. She turned her head, and she looked toward the county road at the bottom of the driveway, and her ears came up and forward, and she made a small, soft sound in her throat, and Jax turned and looked where she was looking. On the county road, in the thin pink light, the first 2 pickup trucks were coming. He did not know how they had known. He would never, in the 17 years of his life remaining after that morning, entirely figure out how they had known. Eloise Mack, he later suspected, had made 4 phone calls from her kitchen at 4:30 in the morning to 4 specific women in 4 specific households in Bisbee, and those 4 women had each made 3 more calls, and those calls had reached 27 more households before sunrise. And every household in that chain had known, without ever needing to have the situation explained to them in words, that the old widow on the county road east of town was opening her water this morning, and that people should bring jugs. The first truck pulled into the driveway. It was an older blue Ford, and the woman driving it was the same woman who had cried in the 3rd row of the council meeting the afternoon before. The gold sunflower earrings, the faded blue cotton shirt. Her husband was in the passenger seat. In the truck bed were 6 5-gallon jugs empty, and a case of gallon milk jugs she had rinsed out overnight in her kitchen sink. Behind her came a dusty white Chevy, behind that a red Dodge, behind that a brown Toyota with the bed panels patched in 3 different colors of primer. Behind that, a small sedan that should not have been able to make the dirt driveway but that was being driven very slowly and very carefully by a woman Jax did not recognize, who had a car seat in the back and a 4-month-old baby asleep in the car seat. They came. They kept coming. By 7 in the morning, the driveway held 11 vehicles. By 7:30, 16. By 8, there was a line of trucks and cars backed up onto the county road for a quarter mile. Jax stood at the east distribution array with a clipboard he had pulled from the shed, and Eloise sat in a folding lawn chair beside him with a second clipboard, and they logged every household that came. 1 5-gallon jug per household per day, plus 1 additional gallon per infant or medically dependent resident. The woman with the 4-month-old received 2 gallons without having to. The man in the brown Toyota, who had his 86-year-old mother in the passenger seat under a quilt, received 3. Nobody spoke. That was the thing Jax would remember for the rest of his life. He would remember that nobody spoke. People drove up, filled their jugs at the basin with the slow, careful ritual of human beings who had not previously understood how valuable water was, nodded once to Eloise, nodded once to Jax. In some cases laid a hand briefly on Smoky's skull, where she sat at attention in the small strip of shade beside the distribution array, and drove away. There were no speeches, there were no apologies, there was no crowd of previously mocking neighbors suddenly becoming penitent. It was better than that. It was quieter than that. What those people were doing, in their silent, orderly line in the rising heat of a Friday morning in July, was the thing Americans of a certain generation in a certain kind of small town had always done when the machinery of the larger world had failed, which was to take water from a neighbor's hand and give nothing back except the acknowledgement, delivered through the eyes, that the neighbor was a neighbor. Eloise Mack sat in her folding lawn chair with her reading glasses pushed up into her thin white hair and her clipboard on her knee, and she wrote down every name in a small, careful hand. And when she looked up at each household as they pulled away, she met their eyes without smiling and without speaking, and they met hers in the same way. And every time a vehicle pulled out of the driveway and turned east on the county road toward town, Eloise wrote a small tick mark in the right margin of her page, and by 11 in the morning the tick marks had covered 3 full pages. At some point, Jax did not know exactly when, he became aware that Eloise was crying. She was not crying in the way a grieving person cried. She was crying in the way an old woman cried when a thing she had thought she would not live to see had happened on her own property, in her own lifetime. The tears came down her cheeks and dried in the heat, and she did not wipe them, and she did not stop writing, and she did not miss a single household. At 11:47 in the morning, under the uncompromising noon-angle sun, Gerald Fitch's silver Mercedes sedan pulled to the end of the driveway and stopped. He did not get out. He sat in the air-conditioned cabin of his sedan, at the very end of the line of pickup trucks, and he watched, for approximately 6 minutes, the slow, ordinary procession of his constituents taking water from the hands of a veteran he had called. 2 days earlier, a man building a fish pond. At 11:53, he put the car in reverse. He backed slowly down the county road for a quarter mile until he could turn around without disturbing the line. Then he drove away. Eloise watched him go. She did not write a tick mark. She wrote nothing at all. She simply set her pen down on the clipboard, and she laid her small lined hand over the top of Jax's scarred hand on the edge of the distribution array, and she left it there for a full 8 seconds. "Son," she said, very quietly. "Yes, ma'am." "Yes, ma'am. And when he comes, you let me do the talking first? You understand me?" Jax looked down at her for a long moment. The sun was very bright on her white hair. Her pale blue eyes were clear and steady and entirely unafraid. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I understand you." Smoky, in the shade beside them, laid her chin on her paws and closed her eyes for the first time in 13 hours, and slept. The line of trucks continued through the afternoon and into the second day. By 4 o'clock on Friday, 704 households had taken water from the Mac property. By sunset Saturday, that number had crossed 2,100. The aquifer continued to deliver at 200 gallons per hour. The catchment continued to hold. The distribution basins continued to flow. A rotating volunteer crew of 3 high school boys and their uncle took over the clipboard at 9 o'clock each morning so Eloise could go inside and sleep for 4 hours. Jax did not leave the yard. On Sunday morning at 9:13, 2 things happened within 20 minutes of each other. The first was that a black SUV with state government plates pulled into the driveway, and 3 people in short-sleeved button-down shirts and state ID lanyards got out, and the senior of them, a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a practical clip, introduced herself to Eloise as Dr. Patricia Alvarez, director of the Southeastern Arizona Field Office of the State Department of Environmental Quality. She produced the inspection hold order. She produced her own credentials. She stated, with a calm that was almost but not quite professional, that she had not authorized the inspection hold, that the hold had been issued without her signature, that the signature on the document was a forged version of her own, and that she was there personally to rescind the order and to commence an immediate voluntary potability analysis of the spring and catchment system. Eloise Mack took off her reading glasses and looked at Dr. Alvarez for a long moment. "Doctor," Eloise said, "would you like a glass of iced tea?" "I would, ma'am. Very much." The second thing that happened was that at 9:24, while Dr. Alvarez's team was beginning their preliminary inspection at the catchment, Eloise Mack found Jax on the porch of the bungalow and asked him to come inside with her because there was something in the attic Walter had kept that she needed him to see. The attic of the Mack bungalow was accessed through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. The space above was low, hot, dark, smelling of old cedar and dried paper, and the faint dry powder of 70 years of fine desert dust filtering through the roof seams. Eloise could no longer climb the ladder. Jax climbed it for her. She called up directions from the hallway below. "There's a footlocker," she said, "on the east wall. Walter's old army trunk from Korea. There's a leather satchel inside it. That's what I need." Jax found the footlocker. He found the leather satchel. He brought it down the ladder. They opened it at the kitchen table. Inside were papers, a great many papers, neatly folded and bound in small bundles with waxed cotton string, mining documents, property surveys, contracts and correspondence in the small careful hand of men who had done their business in ink and blotting paper because fountain pens and blotting paper were what businessmen had done their business with in 1912. Eloise Mack drew out one particular bundle. She untied the string. She unfolded the top document and laid it flat on the kitchen table and turned it toward Jax. It was a geological survey, dated August of 1912, commissioned by Phelps Dodge Consolidated for internal assessment of the western aquifer system of the Mule Mountain Range, authored by a consulting geologist from the Colorado School of Mines named H.W. Forrester. Jax read the document slowly. Dr. Forrester, in the clipped methodical prose of a field scientist of his generation, had documented the mineral content of the western aquifer across a series of 14 samples collected between June and August of 1912. He had concluded that the aquifer, which passed through approximately 400 feet of Permian-era limestone and native copper ore before emerging at the pipe intake on the western slope of Section 22, was producing water of unusual purity, with naturally occurring concentrations of copper, magnesium, calcium, lithium, silica, and a trace bicarbonate spectrum that he characterized, in the final paragraph of his report, as closely approximating the therapeutic profile of the mineral springs at Saratoga, New York, and Vichy, France, albeit at lower overall dissolved solid load. Dr. Forrester had further noted, in a paragraph Jax read twice, that the aquifer's emergence had been known to the Chiricahua Apache for not less than 300 years, and that the waters had been used by that community for the treatment of skin conditions, arthritic inflammation, and post-injury wound care, with documented efficacy that he characterized as remarkable and worthy of further scientific study by parties better qualified than the undersigned. At the bottom of the report was a note in a different hand, written in pencil, much later, probably in the 1970s. Never developed. See additional correspondence. W. Mac. The additional correspondence was in the bundle beneath. There were 11 letters, spanning from 1976 to 2009. They were from 3 different private companies across 3 different decades, each expressing interest in purchasing, leasing, or developing the aquifer on the Mac property for what one of the letters, dated 1994, had called premium therapeutic mineral water commercialization, analogous to the San Pellegrino or Perrier business model. Walter Mack had in his small, careful hand written the same 2 words in pencil at the top of every one of those letters. Declined. W.M. The final letter in the bundle was dated March of 2018. It was from a Phoenix-based company called Caldera Wellness Holdings, LLC. It offered Mrs. Eloise Mack the sum of $180,000 for her 1/2-acre parcel on the county road east of Bisbee, in cash, at closing, with no further contingencies. The letter was signed by the Director of Acquisitions for Caldera Wellness Holdings, whose broker of record listed on the company's signature block was one Gerald P. Fitch of Bisbee, Arizona. Jack sat back in the kitchen chair. He sat back slowly. He folded his scarred hands on the edge of the table. He did not speak for a long time. Eloise watched him. "I never wrote him back," she said. Quiet. "Fitch. In 2018. He came to see me twice. He brought me a pie the second time. I told him I wasn't selling. He said I should think about it. I said I had thought about it. And I wasn't selling. And that was that." "Oh, yes. He kept trying. He's been trying for 7 years. In one way or another. Different offers through different people. But always Gerald in the end." Jax looked at the letter. He looked at the 1912 survey. He looked, in his mind's eye, at Dr. Forrester's small, careful phrase closely approximating the therapeutic profile of the mineral springs at Saratoga, New York, and Vichy, France. The number for a properly developed, state-certified, therapeutically characterized mineral spring with natural artesian flow, domestic aquifer recharge, and direct interstate market access, assuming modest capital investment and an 18-month permitting cycle, was not $180,000. It was approximately $4 million. Jax did not say the number out loud. Eloise Mack did not need him to say the number out loud. Eloise Mack had been married to Walter for 41 years, and Walter had done the math on that number at the kitchen table more than once in her presence, and Walter had walked away from that number because Walter had not wanted to be the man who sold a place the Chiricahua Apache had drunk from to a company in Phoenix that wanted to put it into blue glass bottles. "He was going to buy it from me for $180,000, Eloise said, "and sell it to someone for $4 million. And he was never going to tell me. Was he?" "No, ma'am," Jack said. "He was never going to tell you." "Well," Eloise said. She laid her small lined hand flat on the 1912 survey for a long moment. "Well," she said again, "that is a very clarifying piece of paper." At 11:41 that Sunday morning, Gerald Fitch drove up the county road in his silver Mercedes and parked in front of the Mack house, and he walked up to the porch with a manila folder under his arm, and he asked if he could come in. Eloise, from her rocking chair on the porch, did not stand. Jack stood behind her, one hand braced on the porch railing, Smoky sitting squarely at his left boot. "Gerald," Eloise said, You can say whatever you came to say from right there on the steps." Fitch smiled the careful, tight-mouthed smile of a man who had been a politician for 31 years and had encountered, for the first time in a long time, a room he could not read. "Eloise, I think there's been a tremendous amount of miscommunication over the last few days, and I'd like the opportunity to—" "Gerald," Eloise said, quiet, flat, "I have in my possession a 1912 geological survey commissioned by Phelps Dodge that characterizes the water under my property as a therapeutic mineral spring. I have 11 letters from 3 companies across 32 years offering to buy the property for commercial development of that spring. I have 1 letter from a company called Caldera Wellness Holdings offering me $180,000 for it in March of 2018. That letter lists your name as their broker of record." Fitch's face did something very small and very controlled around the eyes. "Eloise, I think there's context. I have not yet called the State Water Authority. I have not yet called the Attorney General's office. I have not yet called the Cochise County Sheriff regarding the forged inspection hold that Dr. Alvarez informed me this morning was not actually issued by her office. I have not yet called any of those people, Gerald, because I wanted to give you the opportunity to explain to me, standing on my porch, in the presence of this gentleman and his dog, what you thought you were doing." Fitch did not answer for a long moment. His face in the sunlight went through a series of expressions Jax had seen before. He had seen them on the faces of local commanders in villages where a certain kind of local commander had believed, up to a particular moment, that he was still running his own negotiation. The expressions had always followed the same sequence: assessment, calculation, the flicker of a calculation not working, the reach for the charm, the recognition that the charm was not going to land, the arrival at the last remaining option, which was the truth, or something close enough to it to pass for the truth. "Eloise," Fitch said, and his voice had changed. It had lost its public meeting modulation. "I was trying to protect the town. I had a development deal pending. 40 units on the west slope, $12 million of capital investment. I misrepresented the water budget because the water budget was close, Eloise. It was genuinely close, and the project would have brought real jobs to Bisbee. And, Gerald, I'm not asking about the 40 units. I'm asking about my land." Fitch's mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. "I was going to buy your property," he said, finally. "I was going to buy it for Caldera. At 180. And I was going to resell the development rights inside a separate LLC structure for more. For a lot more." "How much more, Gerald?" Eloise nodded once, slowly. "And what was I supposed to do, Eloise?" Fitch said. His voice had begun to rise slightly. "What was I supposed to do? You were sitting on a piece of land worth $4 million, and you didn't know it, and Walter was dead, and your kids are in Oregon, and you have no grandchildren, and every year that land sits there not being developed, the state's water table goes down another 2 inches, and—" "Gerald," Eloise said, and her voice was very quiet, "that piece of land saved 2,100 households in this town over the last 2 days. Do you understand what you're saying to me?" Fitch stopped talking. The quiet on the porch was the kind of quiet that Jax had only ever heard in a few specific places in his life. It was the quiet that came down in a room after a door had closed on a conversation that could not be reopened. It was the quiet that had come down in his own kitchen in Killeen on a Sunday afternoon in February 17 months ago, when his wife had finished saying the sentence he had never been able to bring himself to repeat. It was the quiet that Dr. Forrester, 113 years dead, had described in his 1912 report as the quiet of a mineral spring, which has been known to indigenous peoples for 3 centuries, which has been engineered and forgotten and re-engineered and forgotten, and which has continued, through all of these transitions of ownership and purpose, to flow at exactly the rate at which it has always flowed, without regard for the intentions of the men standing over it. Fitch looked at Eloise for a long moment. He looked at Jax. He looked at Smoky, who looked back at him with the same endless, steady amber gaze she had given him over the chicken wire fence 51 days earlier. He said, "Eloise, I'm sorry." He said it quietly. He said it, Jax thought, with something that might even have been the beginning of something real. But Eloise Mack, who had buried a husband and watched 3 presidents she had not voted for take oaths of office and survived 11 Arizona summers of widowhood, was not in the business of receiving apologies that had been extracted under duress, and she did not nod, and she did not smile, and she did not answer. She said, "Gerald, you can leave my porch now." Fitch left. The Cochise County Sheriff arrived at 2:11 that afternoon, accompanied by an investigator from the Arizona Attorney General's office, and Gerald Fitch was interviewed for 4 hours at the municipal building. He was not arrested that day. He was arrested 11 days later on charges of fraud, forgery of a state document, and breach of fiduciary duty to a prospective property seller, and he resigned his seat on the Bisbee Town Council within 24 hours of the arrest, and his real estate license was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. Caldera Wellness Holdings, through counsel, formally withdrew all prior expressions of interest in the Mack parcel. The 40-unit development on the west slope was canceled. The Phoenix investor, upon learning the true state of the Bisbee water budget, elected not to pursue further projects in Cochise County. The State Department of Environmental Quality, after a complete inspection and potability analysis, certified the Mack Spring as a Class A natural artesian source, with an appended advisory that the mineral profile was of sufficient therapeutic interest to warrant further independent study by the University of Arizona's Department of Hydrology and Medicine. Eloise Mack, under counsel from an attorney in Tucson she had not spoken to in 40 years but who remembered her husband well, filed a water rights claim with the state on the spring and registered the flow as a privately owned source with a community use covenant attached, limiting commercial extraction, guaranteeing emergency availability to the municipality of Bisbee in perpetuity, and prohibiting any sale of the underlying parcel without majority approval of a community trust she established for that purpose and seeded with the first $5,000 of her own savings. Bisbee had a backup water source, a legal, registered, community-covenanted backup water source, for the next drought, and the one after that, and every one that was yet to come. On the evening of the 12th day after the emergency began, the Tucson truck convoy finally arrived. By that point, the Mack Spring had delivered enough water to cover the emergency gap, with a margin of 14% to spare, and the convoy was, for most of Bisbee, a formality rather than a rescue. Jack sat on the porch step of the bungalow that evening, with Smoky lying flat on the boards beside him, and he watched the last of the light go out of the Mule Mountains, and he did not say anything for a long time. Eloise sat in the rocking chair behind him with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair and her hands folded in her lap. "Jax," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Yes, ma'am. It can wait until morning, whenever you're ready. But I want you to know the proposition exists, and I want you to sleep on it." "Yes, ma'am." He did not turn around. She did not need him to turn around. They sat there, in the slow blue evening, and the cicadas came up out of the cottonwood, and somewhere 2 miles down the valley, the Delacroix rooster crowed 3 times in rapid succession and then stopped. Eloise Mack's proposition came at the kitchen table the next morning at 7:14. Over black coffee and dry toast, in the same small, careful voice she used for directions and grocery lists. $800 a month. Cash, she said. The shed is yours. Utilities included. You manage the spring, the catchment, the distribution, and whatever repairs come up on the property. You stay as long as you want to stay. I'm not asking for a year. I'm not asking for 6 months. I'm asking for as long as you want. Jack sat at the table for a long moment with his scarred hands wrapped around the coffee cup. He looked at Smoky, who was lying on the kitchen linoleum by the refrigerator, amber eyes open, tail resting flat, exactly where she had lain on the morning he had first walked the pipe. He looked at Eloise, at the small brass compass on the windowsill beside the reading glasses. "Ma'am," he said. "Quiet. Month to month." Eloise Mack nodded once. Slowly. "Month to month," she said. "That'll do, son. That'll do just fine." He walked out to the shed. In the cool gray light of early morning, Smoky went ahead of him and stopped at the catchment manifold, and she sat down in her working position, ears up, amber eyes on the east horizon where the sun was about to come up, and she waited. Jax stood beside her. He laid his scarred hand once, briefly, on the top of her skull. The people who had laughed at the digging had not known what he was looking for. They had not known they would need it. And the ground, which had kept its water for 100 years, had not cared one way or the other. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.